Hey everyone, welcome to the April 28th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last week's racing from Oaklawn Park and Gulfstream. The two big stakes races at Oaklawn were the Bachelor and the Carousel, both at 6 furlongs, one for the 3-year-olds, the other for the older fillies and mares. We'll talk about both of those. And the big race last weekend at Gulfstream Park was the Unbridled for the 3-year-olds, going 2 turns on the dirt. So we'll recap that race, also talk about some noteworthy allowance races that took place at both Gulfstream and Oaklawn, some notable horses from last year making their 2020 debuts, returning, hopefully to springboard to bigger and better things later in the year. We'll talk about all of that. Craig, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing well. That turned out to be quite the week of racing. A lot of good performances, a lot of big horses here. Unfortunately, we're preparing for some bad weather today. As you noted, my wife posted on Twitter, we got the old shelter ready to go today, but hopefully we don't need it, but it's always there in case we do.
Yes, the other side of the coin where I am, the Northeast, it's actually a nice day here and kind of a week that's been rainy otherwise, so hopefully I'll try to get outside a little bit today. I think, though, we're going to have decent weather later in the week at Oaklawn. I took a little bit of a look at the forecast down there, and I think it's going to be okay for their big Saturday card. We're going to discuss all of that on the TimeformUS forecast, which I believe we're going to record on Thursday this week because they're running that fantasy stakes on Friday. So we want to kind of bring that into the fold and talk about that race a little bit because that one came up pretty interesting as well. But we were talking about it a little bit before we came on air. The Saturday card at Oaklawn is just totally stacked with stakes races. So while this past weekend, was interesting in terms of having some notable horses returning and some minor stakes racing. Next weekend is just going to be a smorgasbord of top racing, especially among the 3-year-olds.
Yeah, like I was saying, sometimes we complain about short fields, but man, these 12-horse fields over and over again, that's a lot of work. And I'm not complaining because it is good for betting, but it is going to take several hours to get through those cards on Friday and Saturday.
Well, we'll get to that a little bit later in the week, but let's, on this podcast, take a look back at last weekend's racing. We'll begin at Oaklawn Park with one of those two stakes races. The one for the 3-year-olds was the Bachelor, going 6 furlongs, and this one featured a pair of really talented 3-year-old sprinters in Long Weekend and Echo Town. Long Weekend got the job done, was really under siege from Echo Town from the start. These two went at it. I didn't think Echo Town was going to be the horse pressing Long Weekend, but I thought these two were really game down the stretch, and they stopped the clock at a pretty fast final time for 3-year-olds at this time of the year.
They sure did. Long Weekend got a 122 for the win. Echo Town a 121, just ahead behind him. And it was a huge gap back to third, 5 lengths and 15 points on our scale. So, I mean, there's just no doubt about it. These are two really good 3-year-old sprinters that we have. This figure it tied Charlatan for the fastest sprint figure among 3-year-olds so far this year. And just overall at any distance is just a point behind Charlatan, which he ran in his second start. He got a 123. So no doubt these are some really good horses. They both showed a lot of gameness, as you said, fighting all the way to the wire. And then we went back. I mean, almost as an afterthought, 8 Rings was in the race, the 2-year-old, the horse who was the favorite in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. And what I found interesting with him is he actually ran a 112, which was his career best, still well below these, but it just kind of shows how these 3-year-olds mature and how fast it can be and how much figures change from 2-year-old to the middle of the 3-year-old season.
Yeah, this is one of those situations which we kind of foresaw was going to happen when we talked about this on the forecast last week, that 8 Rings might get overbet in this race, but I didn't think he was going to be odds on in here. And I mean, I was tweeting about it before the race that this is a rare situation where the exacta with the top 2 horses paid almost $18 for $2. And I mean, you don't always say that an $18 exacta was great value, but I think this is a situation where you could probably make that case because personally, I thought the 2 horses that were most likely to round out the exacta were Long Weekend and Echo Town, and I think you agreed on that. And I'm just surprised that they were 2-1 and 3-1 in this race compared with 8 Rings 4-5. kind of ignored the speed figures and bet the race based on reputation. And 8 Rings just couldn't keep up with Long Weekend in the early going. We talked about how fast Long Weekend had been in his prior start when he won that minor stakes race back in March. He showed that same speed here and just kept going under that challenge from Echo Town.
He did. And yeah, it's one of the real avenues of value left these days is kind of finding the reputation horses and betting against them. It doesn't always work out. Sometimes they come back and run well. Sometimes they don't. We're going to talk about Bellafina in a few minutes. I didn't cash on that one, but it was the same thing. I didn't really think she was worth what she was being bet at. So it is one thing to keep an eye on when you get a horse who has a big reputation from a prior season and hasn't run well of late or is coming off a layoff. It is one of those times when you want to try to strike. You don't have to be right every time, but you're going to be right often enough to make it profitable.
And we probably should mention the time of this race was a few ticks slower than the Carousel, which we're going to talk about next. But obviously, with the way the TimeformUS speed figures work, this race got the much higher number because they went a faster, I believe, opening quarter and especially a second quarter here where they went 44 and change. That was just faster than the pace of the Carousel, which we're going to talk about next. And the Carousel, I thought it was a race where they were just going to go all in on Bellafina. I thought she might be odds on in this race. I have to admit, I was pretty surprised that they bet Mia Mischief down to be 3-2 compared with the 7-5 on Bellafina. Bellafina was just barely the favorite in the end. I didn't think that Mia Mischief deserved to be to attract that much support because her recent speed figures were just significantly slower than Bellafina had been running, but apparently, people knew that Mia Mischief was going to get back to her better races here, and she did. And Bellafina, we'll talk about what happened at the start, but she just never got a chance to run her race.
No, she didn't. And I couldn't have been more wrong about Mia Mischief. She's been winning, but she's been doing so with lower speed figures. But she rebounded. And as our friend Andy Serling would say, they knew because I was shocked by the betting. I couldn't believe she was 3-2 and you know, as they were going to post and nearly favorite, but she certainly lived up to it as she just basically destroyed this field. She had that nice outside post. She sat off of the very fast Amy's challenge and just put her away, and nobody else really came running. Bellafina, you know, obviously she kind of lost the race at the start. I'm not sure what that move was down the backstretch where Joe Talamo went wide and just decided to go for it. I guess at that point, it really doesn't matter. Things aren't going to turn out well, most likely. So I don't have any problem with him putting her in the race, but she just sort of flattened out after that big move, had nothing left. I'm not really sure what to make of that effort by Bellafina. I really still don't buy the California thing that she only runs well in California. I'm not going to totally write her off of that one, especially given it was a 6 furlong race, which is probably shorter than she likes. So while it wasn't encouraging, I'm just not going to give up on her because we did see some flashes. As for the others, Mia Mischief, like you said, she seems back to her best if she even ever left it. It's hard to say. Maybe the figures were just she ran what she had to do to win, you know, without being extended. But this was a good effort. It was the usual solid effort by Amy's challenge. She got a 115 back in second. 118 for Mia Mischief, just a little bit below long weekend because of that pace. But good effort by the top two and not much else, really.
Yeah, I feel like Mia Mischief is just one of those horses that I can't be right about. I was way against her in that Humana Distaff last year, and it was a very similar situation. She hadn't run that fast in her prep races at Oaklawn, and she was stepping up to face a much tougher field. I mean, this wasn't a grade 1 race, but it had a grade 1 horse in Bellafina in it. And just like in the Humana Distaff, I mean, Steve Asmussen had her primed to run her A race on this day. And as you said, maybe she's just one of these horses that as she's getting older, she does what she needs to do and she runs to the competition because she was as good as ever here. And she just dominated. And once Bellafina didn't show up, she just had the number of the rest of these horses. As for Bellafina, I mean, we had talked about it on the forecast last week that the rail could be a real issue for her if she doesn't break well, and if she gets outrun in the early going, which the pace projector kind of hinted that might be the case, and the slow break definitely didn't help matters. And as you said, I don't want to be too hard on Joe Talamo because it wasn't the plan that they hatched before the race, I'm sure, to take her that far back and to make a premature move. And I think when you have to think on the fly like that, sometimes you make tactical errors. and you move a little too soon. And I think that's what happened. Other riders who are more patient in those situations might have just allowed her to settle at the back of the pack and tried to make one run. Still, I don't think she would have beaten Mia Mischief because she just would have had too much ground to make up, but I think she probably would have done better than fourth if they hadn't gotten so aggressive on the backstretch after that slow break. But Bellafina, as you said, maybe 6 furlongs just isn't the right distance for her. She's one of these bigger horses who can take a while to find her stride. I really do think she's more of that 1 turn 7 furlong, even out to a mile kind of filly. So maybe going longer is going to be better for her in the future. I'm not going to write her off based on this one performance because she had been so good prior to this. Moving back to Friday's card at Oaklawn, we're going to talk about a couple of allowance races that took place. Sticking with the 6 furlong theme, both of these were also 6 furlong races. The 9th race on that Friday card was an allowance for the older horses. And Steve Asmussen also won this race with an up-and-coming 4-year-old that looks like he might have a say in the sprint division this year. That's Volatile, son of Violence, who is making just his 4th career start. He's now 3 for 4 in his career. He just destroyed this field. I mean, the pace wasn't that fast, and that certainly helped him. But I love the way this horse leveled off through the stretch and beat these runners. Kind of reminded you a little bit of the way that Mitoli looked at the beginning of his career. I know he was a 3-year-old when he was putting forth these kind of performances. But since he's in the same kind of barn, you just wonder what this horse can do and what his ceiling might be, because I don't think we've seen the best of him yet.
No, this was a really good effort. It got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure, and the final time was actually 125. I know we talked about on some earlier podcasts adjusting the algorithm. That is something I'm working on. Hope to have it implemented within a week or so. So he would probably show a higher figure than that 119, maybe a 123, 124. But regardless of the figure, this was a big effort. Like you said, the pace wasn't fast, but he did face some pressure from a pretty decent horse and Strike That. I mean, he's no killer or anything, but he's a horse with solid early speed that, runs around 110 speed figures when he's good. So he beat an okay horse, and just the way he did it, it's hard not to imagine that stakes races aren't in his future. There is a little concern. He got a late start. I don't think he debuted until July of his 3-year-old season. Ran 3 times. Now he'd been off since November before just coming back. So I assume he's got some issues, but if they can keep this horse together, he's certainly got plenty of talent.
For sure. I mean, and there obviously have been some issues here. I mean, even when he ran 3 times last year, he had about 2 months between each start. So they've definitely handled this horse carefully and brought him along slowly. But as long as Steve Asmussen can keep him on this path and where he's taking a step forward with each race, I think we'll see him in Stakes Company next time. And this kind of speed figure is going to make him competitive against the horses that we saw in the Count Fleet last week, because they earned a similar kind of number. And actually, his final time number was faster than those horses ran. So I think he is of that caliber. We'll just see if they can keep him together. He's certainly got a pedigree to be this kind of horse. His dam, well, she wasn't much. She's out of Lady Tack, who Steve Asmussen trained to win the Grade 1 test a number of years ago. We talked about another progeny of Lady Tack that Steve Asmussen has. I think that 3-year-old filly, her name is Casual, who won her debut maybe just last week or 2 weeks ago. So definitely some good horses in Steve Asmussen's barn from that pedigree. And I'll be interested to see where this horse goes next.
Yeah, and these are horses I always like to look at. If this horse shows back up in a month, and I just always take that as a really good sign. Now, obviously, given what the state of racing these days, it's hard to say where there would even be a spot for him to race. But just assuming there is a spot, I'd be looking for this horses in the entries off of this effort. And if he does return pretty quickly in 4 or even 6 weeks, I think that's a great sign, and I'd expect another great effort.
Also on Friday, just one race later, we saw another one of those 6 furlong allowance races, this one for the 3-year-olds. And Tom Amos has another pretty fast horse on his hands in No Parole, who tried the Rebel last time, a horse that we didn't think was going to be successful in that kind of race because there were some questions about how far he wants to go, and he probably wasn't going to do well in the 2-turn race, especially with as much pace pressure as he faced there. But turning back to sprinting, I think, really is the key for this horse, and we'll see how good he ultimately turns out to be, because he hasn't run quite as fast as his stablemate Long Weekend yet, but No Parole was just faster than these horses in the early going, was geared down late. This is another horse that is pretty talented.
Yeah, he got a 113 for the effort, and the final time matched that. The pace was pretty even after. It was a little quick to the first quarter, and he did face some pressure for the first time in a sprint race. The others he had just easy leads the whole way around, never really got challenged. So he did respond well to that pressure. As you say, it's interesting. He's in the same barn as Long Weekend. I imagine that Tom Amoss is going to have to keep these two apart because they have very similar running styles. They're both fast early and like to go. The one thing I would like to note, he was wrapped up on very late, and some people might be fooled thinking he could have ran faster. But if you watch the whole replay, the rider was pretty much all out in the stretch with a really aggressive hand ride until maybe the last 50 yards. So at this point in time, I think the 113 is probably a pretty good reflection of what kind of horse he is.
Yeah, I agree with that. If he was cost anything by Joe Talmo easing up in the late stages, it was maybe 3/4 of a length, not anything that was that significant. I mean, the runner-up American Butterfly was getting to him a little bit at the end, but it is worth noting, just looking at the chart of this race, the two horses that were in closest pursuit to No Parole early, they ended up finishing last and second to last in this race, and it did kind of fall apart behind him as American Butterfly came from farther back, and the third place finisher Rager came from much farther back in the pack. So while the pace isn't color-coded as being fast, it's definitely a situation where No Parole took plenty of heat on the front end, turned those horses away, and it helped the closers a little bit. So I think this is a horse that definitely has real ability and deserves to be assessed off that 113 number, if not even a number that's a little bit higher. I know we had been a little bit skeptical of him going back to his early races, kind of wondering if he could run faster when really put to pressure, because he had won his first three starts very easily. And I think people assumed coming into the Rebel that he might be able to step up. Well, he couldn't step up going 2 turns, but turns out in a sprint race, he really could run faster when put to pressure. And I think we'll see him in a tougher spot next time, just not likely against that stalemate Long Weekend. One more race to talk about from Oaklawn Park is another 6 furlong race. That's the theme at Oaklawn this week. A Sunday allowance race, this one for the 3-year-old fillies. And the big favorite in this spot was Edgeway, who had run really fast in her first 2 starts. She had lost a stakes race last time after contesting a pretty fast pace when run down by Kamari, that exciting Wesley Ward filly who switched from turf to dirt. Getting back in an allowance race here, I think a lot of us expected Edgeway to just blast off on the front end and put forth a similar performance to the one that we saw from No Parole. It didn't quite work out that way because she actually got outrun to the lead in this spot and sort of had to change tactics on the backstretch.
Yeah, it was an interesting race. She had run a 110 first out and a 112 when third in that stakes race behind Kamari. She only ran a 102 on Sunday, but honestly, I was just as impressed with this one. I thought it was a really solid effort. She broke okay, and then she kind of had some trouble. A horse came in on her, and she found herself back in the field a little bit. She made a big wide move around the turn to take the lead, and actually looks like she was just going to run away from the field. But Charming Lady made her work for it a little bit late. But given all the ground she lost and the little bit of trouble she had early, I thought this effort was every bit as good as her first 2, if not figure-wise, just in that she showed that new dimension of being able to pass horses and just a solid effort, and I thought it was professional from her, and I think she'll be back in stakes before we know it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. When I was looking at this race beforehand, it seemed like one that had a lot of speed signed on, but a lot of cheap speed. And it was a situation where I think Tyler Bays did the right thing to not try to send her too hard in the early going, because she was outbroken by a horse to her outside, and she was about a half length behind at the point that he steadied her a little bit to get outside of those horses. And she probably ended up a little bit farther back in the pack than Tyler Bays really wanted, but he got her outside of horses, kept her in the clear, rode her like the best horse, and she just was the best horse. So I think it was the right decision, and I agree with you. If she gets back at a stakes race next time with a reasonable amount of speed signed on, I think we'll see her go back to those front-running tactics and get back to this kind of speed figures that we saw out of her previously. She dug in the late stages. She switched to her wrong lead, but she still got the job done. The runner-up here, Charming Lady, she's not the kind of horse that's going to be running the same speed figures as Edgeway, but she's a decent horse for Tom Amoss, and I think we'll see better things out of her in the future. So I agree with you that this might be a better allowance race than the speed figure indicates.
Yeah, it's one thing. I meant to check the GPS charts and see what they showed for ground loss, but I didn't get to it. But that's something I would recommend to people. It does pay to watch the replay. I don't think those are perfect. We found some mistakes in there from time to time, but for the most part, they're pretty close. And it's one I do want to give a look to and check it out and see what they say.
Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, where, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, there was only one stakes race this week. It was the Unbridled Stakes on Saturday for the 3-year-olds going 1 mile and a 16th. And the heavy favorite in here was Dr. Post. And he got the job done here, but probably caused a few more anxious moments than his backers were hoping for, as the early pace of this race, it's not color-coded as being blue in the TimeformUS PPs, but I imagine the first quarter had to be borderline color-coded as slow, because they were not moving going that first quarter in 24 seconds flat. And it was a situation where Relentless Dancer, the number 4 horse, was projected to be on the lead by the pace projector, but for whatever reason, his rider, Chris Landeros, just was totally passive coming out of the gate, showed no aggression, reined him in off the speed, and the whole field, the 6 horses, just got so compact moving down the backstretch. And it was a situation where Dr. Post was just locked in and trafficked behind the speed for the entire race until the stretch, essentially.
Yeah, I would say part of that was the pace, and part of that was Luis Saez cleverly riding attachment rate to keep Dr. Post pinned in. I think he knew who the horse to beat was, and he did his best to do it. Not saying he did anything dirty or bad. He just used his horse to keep another horse pinned in. But Dr. Post was able to maneuver his way out, and in the end, once he got clear, he was finishing really strong. He got a career best 112 TimeformUS speed figure, and I do think with some more pace and a better trip, it would have been even higher. And this is a horse that I actually expect to get even better with more distance. I'm not sure what you think about that, but I think he's a horse with a pretty promising future. Attachment rate just ran his usual race. He's decent enough. He got a 110 back in second, but I was actually a little more impressed with Americanus his first time around 2 turns. He did wind up finishing behind those 2, obviously in third, but he got a 111 speed figure for the effort. And I think it was a promising effort from him as well. But Dr. Post, despite only getting a 112, which, that's nowhere near what we've seen in the Derby preps or anything like that, I do think this one has a bit of improvement in him and is going to have a good year.
Yeah, I'm on the same page as you. I think we're going to see some good things out of Dr. Post, because I know that his maiden victory on March 29th didn't get the highest speed figure from us, but that was a race that I think was pretty strong overall. I'm actually looking forward to his stablemate, who was a first-time starter, who was second that day, run back, because he gave Dr. Post a real scare that day, and Dr. Post got the job done. But as you said, 7 furlongs turns out is probably too short for this horse, and I like the way that he finished up this race. I had seen it in his maiden victory that he didn't run the turns that well, and once he switched over to his right lead in the stretch, he really leveled off nicely and put that first-time starter away. And I saw a very similar thing here where Irad Ortiz was really getting into this horse on the turn, and he was going with attachment rate, but he wasn't really going better than that horse. And it seemed for a second like Luis Saez might have actually pulled it off with attachment rate, because he was getting the jump on Dr. Post. But once they got into the stretch and Dr. Post switched over to his right lead, I mean, he put attachment rate away pretty quickly and galloped out well. So I think more distance is going to be fine for this horse, and I would anticipate that with a bit more experience, he might be able to run faster in the future. Couple races later on Saturday, we saw an allowance race for the older horses that went as the 11th on the card, going 7 furlongs, and a couple notable returnees in this race, Spinoff and Global Campaign, horses that probably want to go a bit longer than this, but were making their 4-year-old debuts in this 7 furlong race. And this is a situation where there were 2 speeds on paper, and in scenarios like that, the pace projector is going to predict a situation favoring horses on under the lead, because you don't often think that just 2 speed horses are going to hook up and cause a fast pace. And while the pace figures are not color-coded red, after the first quarter, they really went at it, those 2 speeds, Rare Form and Yorkton, around the far turn, and everybody came off the bridle, and they kind of spaced out the field coming to the top of the stretch, but it was kind of like an accordion coming to the wire as the speeds came back, and Global Campaign, who was making one of those runs from mid-pack, was able to just get up to win about a length and a half and a blanket finish behind him.
Yeah, that's an interesting race. If you look at the race shape on our figures, as you mentioned, you don't often see races like this, especially in a sprint, where the opening quarter was just a 111 and the half mile moved up to a 123, and then the final time was only a 118. So it kind of went up and peaked and then went back down. That is probably the rarest race shape that we have. Maybe the other where it's fast and slow, then fast again rivals it. But it's interesting in these races when you see those kind of pace figures to see who made the moves and at what point they did it. And it'll kind of tell you, who was really doing the most running. And for me, I thought all of the top four actually ran pretty decent races. We don't see races like this much anymore where you get this many good horses in an allowance race. I would say the top four are all really stakes horses. It was a solid return from Global Campaign. He got a 116 TimeformUS speed figure. Yorkton has shown he can handle dirt now. That had been a question with him in the past, but this is two pretty good races in a row for him, so he looks ready to run in stakes races. I don't know if he'll wind up back at Woodbine again this year or on turf, but he's super versatile and can go a lot of different places. Majestic Dunhill, I'm not really sure what was going on with him early. Despite that slow opening quarter, he was way back, but he made a big run and looked full of run in the lane, so good effort from him. And even Spinoff, I thought, ran okay. He kind of moved into that hot pace. He was the closest to the early duel. And while I think this race is probably a little short for him, as you had mentioned on the forecast, I thought it was a solid effort, and I expect a good race from him when he stretches back out.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the two horses that you really would focus on improving out of this race would be Global Campaign and Spinoff, because I think we'll see both of them going longer distances next time. I don't know if Global Campaign is really a class distance kind of horse. I don't know what they have planned for him, but I think a mile is probably a good distance for him, and we'll see where they put him next time. But I imagine they'll be up to stakes company. And Spinoff, too. I mean, he finished fourth in this race, but he was just about a nose and a neck out of second. And he was the horse that Irad Ortiz really tried to ride him to keep up with those two speed horses on the turn when they broke away from the field, whereas Global Campaign got distance a little bit at that point. Spinoff was really ridden to stay in the race. At that second call, you see he opened about a 3-length gap on Global Campaign at that point, and you see it in the pace figures as well, as he got a 14-point bump from the first call to the second call. And I thought he stayed on well enough that going a distance is probably too short for him. So I would anticipate both of them will improve out of this race. Yorkton surprised me a little bit because he's a horse that I thought benefited from a slow pace in that Vekoma race last time, but he really backed up that form here and showed that he can run top races on the dirt as well as synthetic. So I think we'll see him have a good year as well, because this was his first start for Graham Motion. So I don't know if that's just a product of the fact that they're still racing at Gulfstream at a time when they thought he'd be back at Woodbine by now. But maybe if they try some more dirt spots in the future, we'll see a campaign outside of Woodbine for him. Let's move on to another allowance race that took place on that Saturday card. And we're going to stick with Stanley Huff horses here because he brought back Global Campaign off a layoff. And while Scars Are Cool was not off a layoff in this race, he did score his first victory of 2020 because he's a horse that had tried these types of allowance races a few times prior to this during the winter at Gulfstream, had disappointed in a number of races, was beaten by some big margins, but they changed up the tactics a bit this time, took him a little bit farther off the pace, and that worked out well for him as he just got the job done. It did help that his main rival, Legit, just didn't show up at all.
Yeah, this race for me, it was a bit of a disappointment. These are older horses, and the top two finishers only got 114 TimeformUS speed figures. So that's at best listed fringe horses and listed stakes races. So nothing to get too excited for me. Scars Are Cool. The trip was probably the difference. He was able to rate, saved all the ground, somehow got through on the inside. And for me, the real story of the race was Legit, who was, I believe, the odds-on favorite in here. He did have a wide trip on the first turn, but he ran so poorly. I can't use that as an excuse. He just didn't show up at all, and it seemed to me like something went amiss. I'm not sure what it would have been. Maybe we'll hear, maybe we won't. But if he were to run right back anytime soon, I wouldn't want any parts of him because he was pretty bad on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, I'm never a fan of these mile and a 16th races at Gulfstream. I just think it's a distance that they don't have to run as often as they do when they have a mile and an eighth available with a conventional start. It's just so much of these races are run around the turn and you head right into the turn that any kind of outside post position can be a real disadvantage. But as you said, it's hard to make that the only excuse for legit because he ran so poorly and was beaten such a long way. I mean, he is a horse that was off for 2 years in his 3-start career. So there are issues with this horse for sure. So I'm not going to be surprised if we don't see him for a while after this because sometimes it's just hard to keep these horses on the racetrack.
Yeah, let's move on to the.
Yep.
Yep. I was going to say, let's move on to the allowance Thursday race with Untitled. Speaking of, I won't say a disappointing effort. I thought this race was more of a paid workout from him. He was a horse who had been running 110 plus TimeformUS speed figures. He only ran a 104 in this win, but I'm not going to put a lot of stock in that either way. He had no real competition in this race. He was 1-9 for a reason. Visually, I wasn't that impressed either. He didn't look great to me, but I'm not going to knock the effort too much. As I said, I think it was just more of a workout. When he shows up again next time, I'd expect more of that 112 to 115 speed figure than I would the 104 that he ran on Thursday.
Yeah, this was a race that I kind of expected to get a bigger speed figure than it did. I also expected to be more impressed by Untitled than I was. He won easily enough, and maybe he just did what he had to do because he was 1-9 in this race, and he really had no competition. But he did run that gigantic speed figure first time out, and while he sort of backed it up in the Gotham last time, I think we're still waiting to get confirmation that the Gotham was that strong of a prep race. So maybe this horse gets back to some better efforts after this, but I wasn't thrilled with this performance. It probably is just a stepping stone to a bigger goal later on. But I'm not going to put too much stock in it one way or the other. It is kind of a novelty to see a 3-year-old beating a 10-year-old in an exacta at any race. It's something you rarely see because the runner-up in this race, Gray Bow, he's actually 10 years old, has made 50-plus starts in his career. I was looking up his PPs. He actually made his debut before Untitled sire Kozan was even on the racetrack, I think 2 years before that, back in 2013. So just kind of cool to see a 3-year-old racing against a 10-year-old.
Yeah, and just to get into the kind of competition he was beating, that Gray Bow's a 10-year-old. He was also in for a $16,000 claiming tag. So that's why I say I'm just not sure there's a whole lot you can take out of this race. It kind of reminded me of Hidden Scrolls comeback, where, yeah, he actually looked more impressive to me, but he was beating absolutely nothing. So races like that, I kind of just take them more as workouts.
Let's wrap up this podcast with one more race from Gulfstream, sticking on that Thursday card. It was an allowance race on the turf later in the day, going a mile and an eighth. And Temple got his first victory of 2020. He's a horse who has picked up checks in some tougher races prior to this, has faced some good horses at the allowance level as well as minor stakes races. But he got the job done here under just a perfect ground-saving trip orchestrated by Luis Saez. Just really took a chance by staying on the rail the entire way. It opened up, though, for him in the stretch, and he just seems to run the same kind of race every time, and it was good enough on this day.
He does. As you mentioned, he was claimed for $35,000 last year by Mike Maker, and he's just been a money-making machine ever since then. I think he won the Giopani Stakes. He's always picking up checks. Just another really good claim from Mike Maker. I'd say he's a fringe stakes level horse right now. The mile and an eighth certainly didn't hurt, so maybe he wants more distance than the mile and a 16th he's been running in most of his starts this year. And as we know with Mike Maker, if anybody can get him to go longer, it's him. Now, who knows what kind of spots there are going to be in the near future for that. So solid enough horse. Another horse that caught my eye, I mean, not that it was a big stretch because he ran second, was Arthur Kitt. He's a young 4-year-old. He had shipped over last year from overseas and ran it, I believe it was Woodbine. But he was thrown right in against older horses, and he ran okay. But then he didn't show up the rest of the year. But I thought his return race was nice as well. He got a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, and he's one that I think has a promising future as well.
Yeah, I agree. He's the other horse that I think you'd want to take a look at coming out of this race because he had shown a lot of promise going all the way back to his 2-year-old season when he was fourth in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf. They shipped him over here. But he had shown real ability running behind some top horses from that year, going 7 furlongs in a mile in Europe. And for whatever reason, as a 3-year-old, they made the decision that he was just going to be this 1.5-mile horse. And he didn't stay the distance, I think, in a lot of those races overseas. Even that race at Woodbine was 1.5 miles. I'm not going to be surprised if he ultimately wants to go a little bit shorter in the United States races because he produced a pretty good kick here against the nice horse in Temple. And Christophe Clement doesn't always have the ready-to-go off layoffs. So I'm not going to be shocked if he takes a step forward next time, going a middle distance.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I thought it was a solid effort. And that said, I say we wrap this up so we can start handicapping those Oaklawn cards.
Yeah, I think it's going to take quite a bit of time to make our way through that Saturday card. We'll figure out exactly which races we're going to talk about on the TimeformUS forecast later this week because we can't discuss all of them. That would take a little bit too long, but we'll definitely discuss the fantasy on Friday and both divisions of the Arkansas Derby. The second one looks pretty interesting. That's the one where most of the top Derby prospects have ended up in. So we'll talk about all of that on the TimeformUS forecast later in the week, which we are taping on Thursday this week. So expect to see that in 2 days. Remember, as always, you can listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back with some handicapping content on Thursday.